Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Cameron, and I'm a Senior Professional Officer at ICLEI Africa. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this Capacity Hub or training session on Climate Finance 101, an introduction to climate finance. Importantly, this is part of a broader program of sessions currently taking place from the 3rd to the 12th of November as part of the 5th Local Climate Solutions for Africa Congress happening at the moment. So I hope that you're also joining a number of other sessions, and we'll speak about a few of those that you can join or that we believe you may be also interested to join. So a few of those other sessions are just for you to note. Firstly, we'd like to draw your attention to the Transformative Actions Program application training. And we're going to talk a bit about what the Transformative Actions Program is and how it can support cities. So we're having a training session on how to fill in the application forms and how to deliver a high quality application on the 6th of November from 10 till 12. That's this Friday. Then you'll see one of the important aspects that we'll discuss today around climate finance speaks to the enabling environment, and we believe that reporting is critical to supporting this enabling environment. So we'd like to draw your attention to the training session on the ICLEI CDP Unified Reporting Platform training taking place on the 9th of November from 3 till 4:30. And then a third training I'd like to draw your attention to is on it's a bit of a workshop discussion more than say a direct training, is on the 11th of November from 3 to 4:30, and it's investing in urban nature, the investment case for the city of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And here you can see how a city, along with some other partners in ICLEI Africa, have really grappled with some of the issues that we're discussing today. So I think it will provide a very useful hands-on case for yourself. And these are just some of the training sessions, but of course, there's a whole kind of suite of different sessions taking place from now until the 12th of November that I'd also encourage you to go look at the LOCS4Africa website and take a look at the program there, because I think it can only help to broaden your understanding of climate finance and some of the key things that we're going to be speaking to today. So first of all, if you are new to ICLEI, I'd like to just introduce ICLEI. So ICLEI is a global network of over 1,750 local and regional governments committed to sustainable urban development. Currently and globally, we're active in over 100 countries. And really the aim is to kind of influence sustainability practices in urban areas through policy and to drive local action for low emission, nature-based, equitable, resilient, and circular development. Importantly, of course, our cities and subnational governments and regional governments are our members, and we work alongside these members to realize their sustainability goals. So as you can see here, this is a map of all the offices, so you can see the broad reach of ICLEI globally, and also where we are located. So I myself work at the ICLEI Africa office in Cape Town, South Africa, where we are located today. And as I mentioned, there are 5 pathways in which ICLEI operates, or through which ICLEI operates. So there's low emission development, nature-based development, equitable and people-centered development, resilient development, and circular development. And then here at ICLEI Africa, we are also host to the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. And we offer cities a broad portfolio of supportive services, specifically kind of seeking solutions and local solutions to the complex issues surrounding natural capital and the degradation of ecosystem services in a rapidly urbanizing world. So this is just another area of our work here at ICLEI that I'd like to draw your attention to. So now let's get to this session in particular. Today we'll be talking about climate finance, and this is really quite a high-level introductory session. And so it's really just a starting point for what I hope will be a longer journey for each of you joining us here today and your colleagues in exploring how your cities and how partners can better support cities to access climate finance and what it means to actually finance climate projects. Importantly, this session is brought to you by the Urban Low Emission Development Strategies Project, which is implemented by UN Habitat and ICLEI globally, and is also funded by the European Commission. So using this session, just using the platform, during this session, you'll see to the right of your screen, you have a control box where you can learn more about the session, and you can see specifically my bio. Then also ask questions and receive answers. So there are specific points at which we will respond to questions. Also, there will be polls, so please look out for those, and I'll let you know when they become live. There also will be made available a list of relevant resources, and also you can request technical assistance from the help desk if you're having any difficulty with the platform. And then please note that this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the LOCS4Africa website and on this platform in the auditorium tomorrow morning. And so if you want to also refer people to this session at a later stage, you can do so through the recording. And we really would like to encourage participation during this session. So please type your questions in the Q&A box at any point in time during the presentation and the training that we're having today. And then we're going to answer these in specific sections of the agenda. And then also throughout, just to note that throughout the LOCS4Africa Congress, you can also join us in the social lounge and other participants in order to network and get to know one another. So what will we learn today? What will be the focus of today? So first of all, we are going to unpack some of the financial mechanisms available to finance climate action. Then understand what is climate finance and how does it flow to beneficiaries. And specifically in this case, our focus of beneficiaries is subnational governments. Then we will have an opportunity to answer a few questions posted by yourselves and the attendees here today on what has been presented in those two sessions. Then we will actually be watching a video which shares some insight from the Development Bank of Southern Africa, a DFI based in South Africa, but with a broad reach across the continent, specifically unpacking some of the barriers and opportunities for cities to access climate finance. And then we'll be having a discussion on this. And so here we will also ask you to post in either the chat or the Q&A if you have any kind of questions or thoughts on what you've heard. And then we're going to unpack, the last session of today is going to unpack what makes a good climate project. And then we will reflect on what we've learned, and I'll again make reference to some of the sessions that you can attend to continue your learning at LOCS. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce the Urban Low Emission Development Strategy Project. So currently it's urban-led and it's in phase 2. Phase 1 was from 2012 to 2016, and phase 2 has been from 2017 and ends in March next year. As I mentioned, the fund is the European Commission, with the implementing partners being UN Habitat and ICLEI. Currently it's being implemented in 65 cities across 8 different countries. So South Africa, Rwanda, Bangladesh, Colombia, Laos, PDR, Indonesia, Brazil, India, and Europe. And the focus areas of this project are really around operationalizing climate action in municipal decision-making, enhancing multi-level governance to increase implementation of local climate actions, and improving capacity to access climate finance. So what's important here is many of the kind of lessons that I'm sharing are also from kind of our experience of working with cities on these and other partners on this matter of increasing access to climate finance. I'd also like to draw your attention to the Transformative Actions Program, or TAP. This is a flagship program of ICLEI, and this is the training that we'll be doing on Friday, but I just really wanted to introduce it here in one slide. And also, if you'd like to learn more before Friday, you can also go look at the TAP website. So the Transformative Actions Program is an innovative initiative that aims to catalyze and improve capital flows to cities, towns, and regions and strengthen their capacity to access climate finance and attract investment. So through TAP and its partners, local and regional governments can receive support to develop infrastructure concepts into highly transformative, mature, robust, and bankable projects ready for financing and implementation. And importantly, the TAP also connects local and regional governments with technical experts and other finance institutions to kind of take the next step in terms of developing more bankable projects and actually ultimately developing a pipeline of bankable projects. But we'll talk about all these kind of terms if they may be a bit unfamiliar. That's what today's session is about, to really talk about some of these terms. So now I'd like you to look at the poll that should be going live now. And I'd like, as participants, if you could answer 2 questions. The first being, how would you rate your current knowledge of climate finance? So low, medium, or high. And how would you rate your current experience in accessing climate finance? Low, medium, or high. So you have no experience, that would then be low, or you've submitted lots of applications and you've successfully been able to access climate finance, that would be high. So we're just going to take a few moments to allow all the attendees to complete this poll, and it will give me as a facilitator the opportunity to understand kind of the level of the current knowledge in the room. Okay, I hope you all have had a chance to answer the poll. We're going to close the poll in about 30 seconds, and then we will come back to the responses and share those with you in a moment. Okay, so now let's get started in terms of getting into some of the meat of this presentation. First of all, I think this is an important slide that I always like to start with because it gives a broader overview of potential ways in which climate projects can be financed. So importantly, often I find in the work with cities that I do is that climate finance is often thought of as that which you need to apply for external funding. And so what's really important is to understand all the financial mechanisms and non-financial mechanisms available to cities to finance climate action. So first of all, the financing of climate action is fundamentally made possible through an enabling environment. And that enabling environment consists of good governance and robust financial management. And so by getting your house in order as a local government or subnational government, there is the opportunity to kind of de-risk projects, and we'll talk about risk management a bit later. But without good governance and robust financial management, it will be difficult to properly allocate funds for your internal financial resources that may be available, but and then also it'll be more difficult to access external finance for projects, because many external funders and financiers like to understand the health of the organization that they are giving money to or lending money to. So this is very important, going into partnership with. So this is very important, and I would say this is a first step towards financing climate action. Also, policies and bylaws should be in place to support and demonstrate political will. This is very important because these are often mechanisms that are within the kind of that are in the control of local governments or subnational governments, but are not always considered climate as the first stop for climate action. So, for example, in the city where I live, which is the city of Cape Town, when we experienced the drought a few years back, one of the things that was done to kind of make the city more climate resilient overall was really to through the water bylaw, an update to the water bylaw. Now, this didn't cost the city any kind of, other than some internal resources, it didn't cost the city significant money, but what it did is it unlocked private investment in water efficiency. And this is very important because I think many local governments can often overlook the power that and the significant action that can be taken if policies and bylaws are well designed so that the citizens and community groups and the private sector can really come in and support their implementation. So what I would say is once you have that enabling environment, the next thing is to really look at your internal financial resources that may be available. Now, of course, these vary according to the mandate of the municipality or the subnational government, the region or the state. And so, you know, you do need to know this in terms of what resources you do have available. But the question is how can we use intergovernmental grants, tariffs that are paid for services, and rates? How can we use those to finance climate action, and how can they actually be used? And a lot of that comes down to actually strong revenue management, which again speaks to the robust financial management. And then, of course, the fourth area I'd like to highlight for internal financial resources is procurement. How is money spent? So cities themselves, subnational governments themselves, are both, they are drivers of demand. And so it's very important to understand what you can enable and implement climate action through, or sustainability action through, what you choose to buy. You can choose to buy very harmful chemicals that go on to pollute water systems in your city to clean your buildings, or you can choose to buy more environmentally considerate cleaning materials. Obviously, this relates to market, and there's a lot more to unpack in terms of sustainable procurement. But this slide is really just to trigger some thoughts that there's a lot more out there, maybe, than just thinking and looking to get external financing. So now we come to the external financial resources. And here, this money, and we'll talk about where it comes from, but this really comes from philanthropic funds, so that are donated. They also come from the public sector, so international other governments, and through kind of bilateral agreements and arrangements with countries. Funds do come in for specifically sustainability and climate action. And then, of course, there's the private sector. And the money that comes from external sources generally comes in 4 different types of finance. The first is grants. So grants is money that you don't necessarily need to pay back, but there will be requirements of things that need to be achieved in order to validate why the grant has been spent. So increasingly, grants are being really kept for the beneficiaries that are most in need, and because you can't with reductions in kind of in reductions in GDP, and then the kind of knock-on effect in terms of the fiscus of different countries will impact grants. So it's understood that the pool of grant funding, there is grant funding available, but it's not exhaustive. It's not the most extensive pool, and so it really has to be very strategically applied. And so the case you have to make in order to access grant funding is you have to make a very robust case, even though you don't have to pay it back, but you still have to make a very robust case in order to access it. Then the second type is loans or debt. So here we're very familiar with this for any of us that either have taken out a loan for a house or for a car ourselves, or for any other type of loan. Here, what's important is to ensure that the regulations, that everybody understands, all officials understand what is possible. So not all subnational governments are enabled through their national policies and regulations to enter into an agreement where there is a loan or debt, and loans need to be repaid over time. And this schedule of repayment is agreed to. And the person who's lending the money needs to be very certain that they're going to get the money back. So again, this is where the robust financial management and good governance is an enabling environment in order to access loans and debt. Generally, it's understood that subnational governments do not access loans and debt to their full potential, because often loans and debts actually really comes from the private sector, and that is something that is considered a more untapped potential source of finance for public infrastructure, especially here in Africa. Then we have equity. Equity is when you put in funds and you get back ownership and you get back profit share at a very simple level. Now, of course, you could go into a whole degree just understanding the dynamics of all of these, but I'm just giving a very introductory, points on some of these. What's important is a company needs to be set up in order for equity to come in. So because ultimately you are receiving money and giving over some level of control. Now, you cannot give over control of your municipal council. So you're not going to receive equity as the municipality, but if you set up a special purpose vehicle or enter into some form of public-private partnership, then you're able to think innovatively about how equity can assist you. And that's, again, something that generally comes from the private sector, equity. Then we have an increasingly used financial mechanism, which we would put under external financial resources, which is guarantees and insurance. So here, a guarantee is something that helps, or insurance helps de-risk a financial contribution or financial resources that have been put in. So this is, you'll hear a lot around the different opportunities that are available for cities or private sector to access finance. And increasingly, you'll hear more about kind of credit guarantee mechanisms. So here, at a very high level, it's about ensuring that the money that has been put in and requires a repayment, it guarantees that that money will be paid back in some way. So it helps de-risk, okay? So that's it again at a very high level. So what's important to note here is that when we think of climate finance, when we think of financing climate action, we really shouldn't be thinking only of looking for external funds, but we should really start with the enabling environment, then consider internal financial resources, and where these are no longer sufficient, to then look externally. And this is a sort of menu of options that you can start to consider. So it's maybe a lot broader than you initially thought. So I would like to just look at the poll quickly here. And I see that we have some responses. So in terms of how would you rate your current experience in accessing climate finance? 64% of participants said not experienced, 21% somewhat experienced, and then 14% highly experienced. And then the second question, how would you rate your current knowledge of climate finance, is somewhat knowledgeable, 63%, not knowledgeable, 25%, and highly knowledgeable, 13%. So I'm really looking forward to not only actually answering the questions myself, because if we have about 14% of people who are highly knowledgeable, please also feel free to respond to some of the questions that you see. We will also be responding to some questions. But yeah, so overall, it seems that people are, their current knowledge is, you have some knowledge. So I think what's also important here is that this will be a great resource for you to also use as kind of train the trainer, and to be able to share this knowledge with your colleagues. So we've tried to condense what can be quite a large topic into this hour and a half that we have together. And so I hope this will also be a resource for you to share this knowledge and your knowledge further. So for those who are kind of, this is quite a new topic, the important point about financial mechanisms to finance climate action, or you could also call them climate finance, is that fundamentally climate finance starts off as normal finance. So in order to understand climate finance, we have to understand certain terms and certain kind of concepts that are also the same in finance. And so these are a number of terms, and there's a whole glossary actually provided that I'd really recommend you have a look at. This glossary is available at the TAP website, and so please take a look at that. But I'm just going to point to kind of two terms here, just for the sake of time. So the first term is bankability, because this is a term we hear a lot. Bankability has a few different, in my experience from also speaking to different people, it has a few different potential definitions. So some would say bankability is any project that has been able to attract finance, with whatever type of finance it may be. Whether that finance is kind of grant finance, where it doesn't have to be paid back, or where it is whether it's external resources, such as loans or debts or equity, or accessing funds from the private sector. So the other way to look at bankability is really to see that bankability is a project that's able to attract private sector finance. So private sector finance, so often if a project has only been able to access grant funding, for example, some would say that isn't a bankable project, but I would say that we can broaden the understanding to somewhat and say that basically a project that is able to reach transaction stage is a project that is bankable. So how do we get more projects that are able to reach transaction stage? The second term I'd like to kind of unpack a bit here is concessionality. So this is an important way in which grant money is being used more effectively and efficiently now, is that it's being blended. Okay, so blended is when you mix financing or funding from different sources and put it into a project or a program. And concessionality really speaks to the idea of using grant money, so money you don't have to pay back, to actually reduce the interest rates on loans. So this is really important. This is where DFIs come in, and we're going to hear from DBSA a bit later on this. But concessionality is an important aspect that often climate finance is around concessional finance. So it's cheaper finance because we want to achieve kind of we have these other desired goals. And so the interest rates for loans often don't sit at market rate, but they sit kind of below market rate to encourage uptake of an implementation of these projects using climate finance mechanisms. So again, I would encourage you to look at all the I think it's an 11 or 17 page glossary that we have available. And it's very helpful because I think one of the key things is in terms of the concept of building capacity to access climate finance by subnational governments is that as subnational government officials, we need to get better in speaking the language of financiers and being able to understand what they are speaking back to us. So often these sorts of terms are used and many others. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at that glossary. So what is climate finance and how does it flow? So here, climate finance refers to local, national or transnational financing drawn from public, private or alternate sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. So here, what you'll see is that climate finance is actually any finance. It's any money that's being used to either reduce greenhouse gas emissions or mitigation, or to reduce the vulnerability of residents and businesses to the impacts of climate change, also known as adaptation. So the point here to focus on in terms of climate finance is really it's about the impact that you're wanting to have. But all those financial mechanisms that we spoke about, all of which we're actually familiar with, from procurement to grants and loans and equity and rates and tariffs, whenever any of that money is being used for the purpose of addressing climate change, it actually is climate finance. So this is how the UNFCCC defines climate finance. So it's not only money that comes from climate funds. So that's quite important. We're now going to watch a short video from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which I think gives a really great overview of the kind of climate finance, and the link to this resource is available in the resources page at the end of this presentation.
Climate change is not in the distant future, but happening now. And climate change is not in the distant future, but happening now, and it is already having severe consequences for societies and people's livelihoods. Politicians, scientists, civil society organizations, and advocacy groups, such as the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, as well as communities around the world, are grappling with these impacts and costs. Potential ways towards a sustainable and just future exist, But shifting away from fossil fuels and strengthening the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies is expensive. Some, but not enough financing for climate action has been pledged and collected to ensure that funds are available for the necessary changes. But where does the money come from? The money should come from the countries that are responsible for the damage and have the capacity to make it right. This is a matter of justice, climate justice. Industrialized economies such as the United States, England, and Germany have profited from carbon-intensive economic development. But this development path is no longer an option for poor countries that need to skip a few steps and go directly to using clean, renewable energy. Meanwhile, small island nations and heavily indebted poor countries are hit the worst by the impacts of climate change. This is even more unfair considering that their contribution to the problem has been minuscule. In these countries, the worst affected people are the poor and marginalized, women, the disabled, the elderly, and the indigenous peoples. Climate change aggravates existing problems such as inequality, discrimination, and poverty. This is why climate finance should be targeted to help vulnerable population groups. Rich countries owe developing countries a historic climate debt. Based on the key principle of climate justice, that polluters must pay, it is their obligation to help pay for the costs of addressing climate change. So, how much money is needed? Careful estimates say hundreds of billions, if not trillions. And the longer we wait to tackle climate change, the more expensive it gets. In 2009 in Copenhagen, industrialized countries committed to contributing $100 billion annually by 2020 to address the issue. Since then, many climate funds and initiatives have sprung up. But rich countries' contributions have yet to reach their goals. And the long-term future of many climate funds is not secure. While rich countries are supposed to take the lead, most of the money today comes from the private sector, and governments increasingly give loans that need to be paid back. However, loans place a strain on poor recipients, and investors often have priorities that do not align with the needs of communities and countries. This is why public climate finance should be mostly in the form of grants, especially for helping communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. But what's this money for in practice? Climate finance is used to fund projects in mitigation or adaptation, and more in cross-cutting activities that combine both. Funding for adaptation builds hurricane shelters or seawalls. It restores mangrove forests or wetlands, helps manage water systems to deal with severe droughts or floods, and provides farmers with better seeds and forecasts to improve their yield despite unpredictable weather. When done well, these projects allow communities to bear the worst effects of climate change and adjust their livelihoods to an uncertain future. Mitigation projects reduce greenhouse gas emissions by shifting energy production towards sustainable sources. Examples of this include funding for clean transport in cities, generating renewable energy from wind and solar power, or planting trees in deforested areas. These projects can address energy poverty in rural areas by distributing renewable energy to people who have never had electricity. They provide clean cooking solutions to the 2.7 billion people worldwide still using traditional biomass fuels like wood or dung. And they also provide entrepreneurs with the cheap loans needed to buy energy-efficient equipment. However, not all mitigation projects are good projects. Large hydroelectric dams can displace people and destroy their livelihoods, while growing food crops for biofuel can increase food insecurity. Misguided climate mitigation can easily make things worse. The most successful projects put people first and give communities and marginalized groups a strong voice in designing and selecting them. With so little money available for climate projects, only the ones that do no harm to people or the environment and the ones that benefit human rights and gender equality should be funded. But there is so much more to understanding climate finance. Check out our following videos on the gender dimensions of climate finance and on the Green Climate Fund, one of the largest public global climate funds.
Great. So that was just a short video from the Heinrich Böll Foundation that believe provides a bit of a description in terms of climate finance and where it kind of the idea behind where it started, especially with all these climate funds and the kind of moral obligations that it touches on. So importantly, what is necessary to understand is how climate finance flows to beneficiaries, because what is important is that in its current setup, it is not always possible for subnational governments to directly go to climate funds and or other DFIs or funders and financiers necessarily to actually to access climate finance. So what's really important, and this is an oversimplified diagram because of course there are certain funders and financiers that do, put money directly into the beneficiary level at implementing for implementing partners for subnational governments and kind of other project managers. So they could be kind of community groups, that sort of thing. But when it comes to specifically the largest climate finance fund, which is the Green Climate Fund, the funds come in mainly from public sources, but they're also funds from kind of philanthropic and private sector. And these flow to the kind of DFIs and other climate funds. So the climate funds are the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, and the Adaptation Fund, amongst a few. And then, of course, we have the World Bank and we have other multilateral development banks. And we also have kind of, we have the national development banks, which sit at the kind of the DFI role, but also they're sitting as financial intermediaries. So these, in order to access the Green Climate Fund, every country has a national designated authority. Generally, this is someone who is appointed in the national ministry, mainly for environment, but it can be another national ministry according to how that country has decided. And this is someone or a kind of department that is responsible for almost giving their kind of signature of approval that the projects or programs that are requesting funding from the Green Climate Fund in particular are in line with the national requirements. Alongside these national designated authorities, some countries, and increasingly more, have accredited entities. These accredited entities are often development banks, but also can be other institutions that are accredited by the GCF to actually receive funds. And so these are the people or the organizations that put forward the applications. So only accredited entities can be submitting GCF proposals. But of course, they work with many partners. That's the important part. And for example, in South Africa, we have the Development Bank of Southern Africa that is an accredited entity, and it is able to access both loans and grant financing from the GCF, whereas there's another entity or accredited entity called the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and they are only able to accredited to access grants and only up to a certain value, that's $10 million compared to the DBSA, which can access more. Now, it's very important that as beneficiaries or as partners to beneficiaries to know who the national designated authorities are in each country and to form strong relationships with these entities. And then, of course, with the accredited entities too, because they might have a pipeline that the city could fit into. Because what's really important is what these accredited entities often do is they create larger programs. So an individual project, which from a city, especially say an intermediary city or a more rural kind of local or subnational government, is not often of a significant transaction scale or size to warrant the flow of funds, because it can be quite expensive to move money, for example, between institutions or from outside a country into a country. So what you want to do is you want to see what are the current programs which are available, and the accredited entities would have that information, and national designated authorities also. So the GCF website in particular has has a full list of national designated authorities and accredited entities. And so I would say, if you're interested to know who this is in your country or the countries you work in, then please go look at that on the GCF website. There are, of course, other implementing partners and fund managers that also do explicit climate action. So, you know, it's not only the GCF, but they are one of the larger funds available. But of course, there are lots of other banks, many kind of European or country-based national banks that also do a lot of climate financing, especially here in Africa. And then the finance flows to beneficiaries. So there is a kind of a call to make it possible for local governments and subnational governments to be able to apply to climate finance institutions or kind of funds directly, and not have to go through national designated authorities or accredited entities due to, of course, in some countries there can be you know, different approaches taken at national versus subnational level. But at the moment, this is how it is kind of currently set up, and there is training available on how to submit GCF applications on their website. There are also other entities such as we of course have FUNEWA in Rwanda, so that's the Rwanda Green Fund, and we have a number of other entities, but that's also set up specifically as a climate finance institution that disperses funds to beneficiaries. So I think one of the main kind of recommendations to make for all local and subnational government officials is to find out who are the people who are responsible for dispersing these funds in the country that you are working in. So a climate finance project in particular needs to have a number of areas, and this is where it starts to get a bit more complex in terms of designing a climate project that can be financed, because different climate finance institutions or different funders have different requirements. And so it's always good to start thinking, when you start thinking about how to finance a project, you want to start thinking about who could finance it. This is the reason why on one of my first slides, I said, look to your internal resources first to see what is possible. Because as you can hear from what I'm saying, it can be quite resource intensive. Especially maybe the first time you go through this process of looking to attract external financial resources to support your climate action. And also, when we'll talk to this a bit later, but the importance of bringing partners on board to help you do this work. So importantly here, there are a number of kind of factors that you can see here around impact potential. So here we have to think of what is the potential of the program or project to contribute to the achievement of the fund's objectives. Now, you must remember the project that you or the local government you're working with may be submitting is, or even if it's part of a national program, is not the only project or program or request for funding on the desk of these funds and these fund managers. They are looking at how do they get the largest impact from the money available. And so a lot of the kind of the finesse of writing a good climate project proposal and being able to attract finances around demonstrating impact. And so we'll speak about that a bit, but also definitely we're going to speak about it on Friday in even more detail. So there's another area around paradigm shift potential. So the degree to which the proposed activity can actually catalyze impact beyond a once-off project. So here again, doing a once-off project is beneficial, but again, these funds are looking for how do you do more with the money available. So by doing the project you're asking for, or the program you're asking for, does it actually release kind of a waterfall or a cascade of further investment or larger impact, or will it enable the private sector to come on board more easily? So that's what is meant by kind of paradigm shift potential. Sustainable development potential, important here is kind of the wider benefits and priorities of the project. So, you know, looking at the co-benefits. So climate is the main benefit, and it must have a climate, climate impact. So whether it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions and or reducing vulnerability to climate impacts. But then over and above that, there are always possible additional environmental, social, and economic co-benefits. And importantly here is around gender-sensitive development. and improving on gender equality, but also reducing kind of the vulnerability of more marginalized groups, whether that's socio-economically marginalized. Then just for the sake of time, I'm going to touch on this idea of efficiency and effectiveness. And here it's about proving that the money you're asking for is actually the best possible way that this money could be spent, and that the solution you provided is the most effective solution to dealing with that challenge. And so cost effectiveness is an incredibly important kind of motivation to ensure that your project has in it. So to ensure that the money available is being put to its best use rather. So here, this is a slide. Now, this is again is a bit of a simplification, especially as we're learning through the LOCS Congress. You know, there are a lot of many innovative and new ways of thinking about financing, adaptation, and mitigation. But what you'll find is that the vast majority of climate finance up to now has flowed into mitigation projects, because, and this is also from the private sector, but also kind of larger scale public sector investment, because there's usually a direct revenue from those projects. So if we think of a mitigation project, we can think of a renewable energy plant, so say a solar plant. So someone's paying for that electricity at the end of the day, so you can pay back any loans or anything like that, and you can de-risk them relatively easily. And so often it's a mitigation project like that, it's easier to crowd in different types of finance for that project. And so they are more currently, and I think this is I believe this is shifting now, because it needs to shift, because we don't only need to mitigate climate change, it's very important too, but we know that the impacts of climate change are currently being felt, so we have to adapt to the new climate normal that's being experienced globally and on the continent. But mitigation primarily is able to access private sector finance, so debt, equity, insurance, that sort of thing. And so you're often going to get it more from private and commercial sources. And then on the adaptation side, often you're working with things for the kind of public good. So what you'll find is that there's there's often no direct revenue. So if you think of a seawall, for example, or some form of kind of even mangrove, like replanting mangroves along a coastline to protect against coastal erosion and sea level rise and that sort of thing. There isn't a direct revenue. You can make the case, of course you can, and you should. There's an economic case to be made, and there is a financial case later down the line, but it does take some skill to make that case, especially to look for the direct revenue. So here, this is the important part. This is some of the work we've been doing at ICLEI, and that's why I also invited you to join us at the investment case scenario that's being unpacked on the 11th of November. So there are many indirect benefits also, but because there isn't a direct revenue or cash flow from which repayments can be made, adaptation projects are often often financed through grants or other municipal sources. So this could be through the rate space, for example, in order to finance those projects. And so the sources of the finance often comes from government donors, kind of other grant systems, and from climate funds, who are also looking to, of course, finance adaptation. Now, what's important is that the best climate projects are able to motivate, I would say, that there is both adaptation and mitigation impact from the project. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and just take a look at some of the questions now that are available. So I see that we have a question from Karina, and I'm just, is there any way or any organization that can assist local governments with the development of applications or call for proposal? Most often these documents are quite long and require a lot of data, and most municipalities don't have the time or capacity to complete and submit these. They have submitted, I think it's, if I'm right, Karina Singh from Mzanduzi municipality. but I might be wrong, sorry. We have submitted a few applications, not heard back, assuming the documents we submitted did not contain significant level of data as was required. So yes, so this is part of the difficulty around actually accessing climate finances, is that you do have to apply, and they can be quite onerous to some extent requirements at any time. And here, there are organizations that municipalities can partner with, but I would also say that knowing that you know, there is a need to try find the right partners. So in terms of partners, you know, there's definitely a conversation we could have around with, you know, it's ICLEI Africa as a potential partner, but there are other organizations. And so we'll unpack this a bit more in terms of, you know, the different stages of project development in a bit. But what's really important is that cities, there is currently what is seen to be a gap around providing the financial resources at the very early stage of project development, which is that kind of stage that you're speaking to here, Karina. Because currently, unless a local government is able to partner with an organization that can kind of carry the cost of providing that data and all those things, and providing the technical support, the municipality would need to pay for this sort of assistance. But that's not always possible. But there are kind of an increasing number of initiatives that are looking to finance this. And so one of them is this kind of space or this part of the project preparation process. One of them is the GAP Fund, and we'll talk a bit more about that on Friday, if you'll be able to join us then. And I think the important thing here is requiring a lot of data. So here, there isn't the data that needs to be collected to show impact is both the city level kind of data, but also data around your climate. So climate action planning is incredibly important as a base to have access to data. But I think what I'm hearing from you, Karina, is the the challenges that you've experienced around actually submitting proposals, and that is it's a commonly faced challenge. So that's why it's important that you know, cities, you almost have to think of kind of, to some extent, when you're answering a call for proposals, remember it's almost like a tendering process. So you're not guaranteed. So you have to actually access it. You have to do a number of them in order to be secured one, and you get better over time. But of course, you need the resources to be able to do that work. So I think you know, it'd be great to reach out to organizations like us here at ICLEI Africa. Also to see that also, you know, C40 works with some of the bigger cities, but also does some other work, and they have the Great Cities Finance Facility. There are a number of other institutions that also provide support. But what you want as a city is to get a project up to at least pre-feasibility stage, and you can't, of course, do all projects. So you need to prioritize, because it does take a lot of effort. You're right. It's not just you, Karina. And so this is the important part, I think, in, I don't know if I can answer, I hope I've answered your question to some extent, but to say that almost you kind of have to meet each funder's requirements. And so even if you have one project and you submit it to, say, 10 different funders, you need to be able to adjust how you speak about that project to each one, because they each have different requirements. And so that's why it does tend to be a more time-intensive process to be able to access external funding. That's why it's developing relationships over the long term with potential funders, letting them know who you are, what you care about, that sort of thing as a municipality, your strategic goals. That's important. And reaching out to potential funders. And then also looking at how do you resource this kind of external, you know, having the right expectation, I think is also important, and ensuring that senior management in the municipality understands this process needs to be resourced in order to be more successful. There's also then, I think, after just going to answer this one quick question, then we'll move on. So the slides will be made available, and they will be available on the LOCS4Africa website after the within about a day or so. Once the recording's available, we'll make both available. Thanks. Okay, so haven't got any other questions just yet, but and I see someone has posted some of the climate finance resources. Thank you so much. So I think we'll just move on, and then we'll come back to kind of we'll have a discussion in a moment. So I wanted to just plant this question in your mind while we are watching this video, because we'll discuss it after the video. For you to also, you can, write in the chat as you, all the questions in the questions and answer box as you choose to, as you are listening. And so the question is, from what you heard in the video, what stands out as particularly relevant to your city context? Okay, I just see we got another question. So just quickly, I think, so with Elton has asked a question, how would green bonds be beneficial to municipalities or the government? So here, green bonds are something which, it's a tool which is available to subnational governments. A green bond is basically kind of a loan or debt sort of mechanism that needs to be paid back over time to the people who've put the money in. But it allows for kind of an aggregation of investments from a lot of people at a very high level. Of course, you can go into much more detail. I would recommend actually listening to the Daring Cities session. So if you go to the Daring Cities website, it's a conference that ICLEI globally just finished hosting. And there, the City of Cape Town, in the Innovative Finance session, the City of Cape Town actually presented on their green bond, which is a very successful green bond. And what is very helpful about that presentation is that it showed the numerous steps and kind of significant internal capacity that was required in order to realize the green bonds. So green bonds can be beneficial to municipalities, but they can be relatively complex to establish, and they need quite a lot of what we call that enabling environment in order for them to be successful. What's also very important is the in terms of the kind of how the money is used by the municipality. For example, the City of Cape Town chose a bond where all the money would be made available immediately. And what that meant is that the projects had to be ready to be financed. So often some of the projects they were kind of refinancing, and some of the other projects were, they were already in the pipeline and they were ready for implementation. So what's really important about a green bond is that it takes, it's not that costly to do all the kind of approvals and everything to make it a green bond, but it takes a lot of internal capacity, or partnering with an institution that can provide that capacity. Also then to manage it and ensure that the revenue collection happens, and that there are funds and cash flow available to pay back the investors through the green bond mechanism. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily suitable for each city or each kind of local or regional government to be setting up their own green bond, because of the complexity around it. And maybe it would be better suited to explore one of the other kind of financial mechanisms that we did discuss. So I think from what I've experienced and learned about green bonds is just a word of caution that they're not the most appropriate financial tool for all cities, but where they are, where that city is able to implement a green bond, they can be quite helpful in terms of being able to attract, to free up internal resources. That's what one of the lessons from the City of Cape Town was. And the bond was actually paid back based on rates. So that's also something important, is they have a relatively strong revenue, quite a strong revenue collection mechanism in place, and a very secure rate space. So they were able to provide certainty to investors there. So that would just be some of my kind of initial comments on the idea of a green bond. I think rather to investigate some of those other financial mechanisms first. Okay, so we're going to watch a video now from it's a discussion actually between myself and Olympus Mantata, who leads the Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA's Climate Finance Unit, and really kind of picking his brain around some of the opportunities and challenges for cities, also given the current times. So this video is about, just to give you an idea, it's about 17 minutes long. And then we will come back and have a discussion here.
Thank you so much, Olympus, for joining us today. I think as a start, could you please introduce yourself and describe your work and the impact you're trying to have through your work?
My name is Olympus Mantata with the Development Bank of Southern Africa. I belong to a division called Project Preparation Division, but I head the Climate and Environmental Finance Unit under the same division. So our role really is around, mobilizing climate resources from various sources, which we then blend with own DBSA resources to unlock projects specifically in the climate and environmental space. In that regard, we are accredited to the Global Environmental Facility and also the Green Climate Fund, which we, in the main, source our climate resources from. But we go broader than the two mechanisms that I've mentioned. And in essence, what we try to do is, in our operations in the Sub-Saharan Africa and the islands, we look at how we can support countries in implementing their NDCs. As you would know that financing can be the challenging part. So we see ourselves playing a very important role, especially as one of the few, direct access entities of the GCF. We try to use that role to do our best to support countries in that regard.
Thank you. And from your experience, what are some of the key barriers and opportunities to increasing the flow of climate finance into Sub-Saharan Africa? And specifically, if you could reflect on the need for increased flow of finance to subnational governments.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, the starting point is that, it's clearly accepted that, your public resources, aren't sufficient to achieve the goals that we would like to achieve from a climate point of view. So what is key is, how we can use these resources to unlock private sector investment. And so we do quite a lot of work in designing, financing instruments that are fit for purpose with regard to, their ability to crowd in private investment. That is the one end. But I think on the other end, the challenge that you have is that, the ability and the capacity to develop projects that are bankable, or at least projects that are, funders can at least be able to consider, are quite limited. So we try to build financing instruments that, to a great extent, encompasses project preparation, or even, your early design phase, in such a way that you can be able to, have instruments that talk to the various stages of project development, which we believe is quite key.
Thank you. And how do you see the kind of the immediate and also longer term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic impacting on these barriers that you've unpacked for us?
I think one of the immediate impacts we have felt aside from as a DFI is obviously, you start having a bit of liquidity constraints. And, obviously that impact leads in many cases to cost of funding, skyrocketing. And, you also see resources, if you're thinking of the municipal space, being diverted to other, what would be referred to as more urgent matters. So the question then becomes, what is the best way to respond in the midst of those, challenges? But I think what remains useful is the ability to have appropriate financing instruments, but also, the ability to channel the concessionality that they are receiving from these sponsors, or to make possible the implementation of projects. So I think it's quite key, and I think it's also important to keep reminding ourselves in the process that the climate emergency should not be a casualty of the challenges that we see emanating from the COVID pandemic. Actually, somebody said to me that it's possible to find maybe a cure, or even a preventative measures that you can put in place for COVID, but unfortunately, you cannot get a cure for climate change. So you cannot remove it from the urgent matters that needs to be addressed.
Definitely, and I think the need to kind of be reflecting on the real challenges that COVID has has created with regards to what, as you mentioned, liquidity challenges, both in terms of at the municipal level, but also within DFI is very interesting. And your comment related to the increased cost of financing, I think that's a critical matter that must be addressed, especially in, there's the opportunity around how the recovery funds are spent, both from national governments into national economies, but also coming from kind of multilateral agreements into national economies in Africa. And so now kind of reflecting another angle of to look at these kind of barriers and opportunities, how do you see improved multi-level governance, or as we call it in South Africa, intergovernmental cooperation, being an enabler to increase the flow of finance to cities?
I think for me, the key thing is, I mentioned earlier the importance of unlocking private investment to support, climate-related initiatives. But there's also the important matter of saying, how do you use the resources alongside fiscal provisions? Because in many ways, it is also important to understand the challenges that come with the normal processes of releasing fiscal resources, and blend that with the resources that are available from your climate resources. I think that is quite key, so that in the first place, it's important that there is coordination in terms of how these funds are used, and also to understand the gaps that you aren't able to address through either fiscal resources, to then say, how do you consider fiscal resources, private resources, and also resources that are coming from your climate resources in a coordinated manner to achieve maximum effectiveness. I think that is quite an important matter to consider.
Definitely, I would agree with you on all those points. And so a third lens that I'd like us to reflect on is, how do we use the funds that are coming in from external sources, but also the fiscal allocations available for climate action projects, to also at the same time improve gender equality in our cities?
I think that is an important question, and I'm sure you'll be aware that with the likes of, let's say, your GCF and also the GEF, gender considerations are quite important. Actually, they are quite they are an important factor, in terms of how you design your project. But also, if you look at even at a national level, we know that it is important that gender issues are considered. So, for example, for us in our funding plans, there is a clear requirement that you would have a gender plan that supports the project, and that becomes very much an annexure to the contract that we'll have in place with whoever will be receiving the funding from our side. So in essence, for anybody who is advantage to them with regard to their ability to accessing, this type of finance sources that we are talking to. So I think it's an important matter that we cannot ignore. But I think it's not just about attending to it for the sake of receiving the funds. It is an imperative and it makes business sense.
Definitely. And I think that in terms of what it actually means per project is definitely work that can be bolstered through the project preparation process. So we don't only necessarily think of the technical and financial, but also think of the broader socioeconomic impacts of the projects. And I think that element can definitely be more capacity can be built on how to make that really tangible for each project and be seen as an opportunity and not some burden that's something additional to the project impacts. So now just pivoting the conversation to actions. What specific actions do you believe cities need to take in order to be more able to receive funds and also kind of access the funds available to them?
So for us, what we think is important is, really going to the starting point with regard to planning. We think just from the start, when planning is done, climate issues have got to be integrated into the thinking, and that would then be reflected in the projects that emanate from the initial planning. Because what we have seen as a problem is when people at the end of the project are trying to access climate resources, and you find that you are trying to press feed matters that you had not considered in the beginning, that becomes a bit of a challenge. So, we think it's important to really start at that point. But on our side, what we are trying to do is, based on our understanding of the challenges that we see, especially within cities, is to say, we look at designing programs that would respond to that. For example, what we would do is to say, when we put together financing solutions, we would look at platforms that would help take projects from concept through to project preparation, take them through to bankability. And when they reach bankability, they are designed in such a way that they respond to an existing funding platform that we would have designed. And we think that is the way, we should approach these issues. I'll give you an example. Like now we're looking at, wastewater treatment. There's a lot of, components to look at if you look at the whole value chain around wastewater treatment. And we tried to design a platform that would respond to the various stages and have in place financing responses that would be, able to help at each stage of the development. And we think that is the approach that we should look at. Otherwise, you keep having, maybe feasibility is done at this point. From there, they just end up in file 17 because there is no clear way from the end of the feasibility towards implementation. So we try to look at the whole value chain.
I think that is really important in terms of understanding that, especially when these considerations are maybe newer to some cities and there's need to build capacity, that does come at a cost. And we do need the financial resources to support right from that kind of strategic, almost portfolio level within the municipality of planning down to, and then kind of developing the potential pipeline of projects. There is significant work that, I think we all now understand and that we see from moving from a project idea to moving even into a usable project concept. And especially when it comes to, the issues of scale and kind of developing even programs from project ideas. That also is quite a complex process in municipalities, and also when you're trying to now package maybe a regional approach. And as I said, I think it's really important to take cognizance of all that work that needs to take place within programs that are being designed. So, I mean, that's a great approach in terms of what DBSA is doing. And then in terms of, if we look at if we say cities are really kind of sitting on the demand side of finance, if we look now in terms of some of the supply side actors, the institutional investors, traditional private sector players such as banks, as well as other kind of financing institutions and maybe even national governments, what would you say are some of the actions that they need to take in order to enable greater flows of finance for city climate action?
I think the way I would like to approach that question, Rebecca, would be this way. We have always emphasized that we think, development finance institutions like ourselves, DBSA, play an important role because, sometimes you look at the expectation that is placed on the private sector. It doesn't apply in every sector, but in many cases there might be that you've got barriers that have got to do maybe with regulatory or policy issues. And the DFIs in terms of the space that we occupy, most of these DFIs like ourselves would be government owned. Therefore, one could assume that due to proximity, you can be able to some extent influence things around the policy and regulatory issues. But on the other hand, we are also co-funding with the private sector, including your commercial banks. So one could argue that, you understand the kind of issues that are, expected. For example, the risk return profile that they would be comfortable with. I really believe that the DFIs play that critical role of players in a way that makes it easier, to pull in private investment and to ensure that the regulatory environment is ideal for implementation of projects. So I really believe we can continue to play that important role of, ensuring that the flows from the, for private sector side increases with regard to support to climate projects.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really valuable input in terms of the important role that DFIs do play in terms of almost like a bit of an intermediary. And the importance of intermediaries in enabling finance is critical, definitely, especially in supporting in areas where maybe those intermediary institutions aren't as well established yet across the continent. And so the role of well-established DFIs is very important. Thank you very much. That concludes our interview for today, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Olympus.
Pleasure.
Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed that video, hearing some of the insights from Olympus Montata as the head of the Climate Finance Unit of DBSA. So I'm now going to kind of create a little bit of an opportunity for people to ask questions or post in the chat to really reflect on, to reflect on this.
Thank you so much.
Apologies for that. Just a technical glitch on my side. Just to reflect on the question of, from what you've heard in the video, what stood out or what stands out as particularly relevant to your city or your context, or do you have any questions that you would like to discuss that we could even open up a bit for others to respond to on the Q&A? So I'm just going to give it a few moments and let everyone have a chance to respond. Okay, so we're going to start with the first question that we have received, but please keep sending in questions or comments reflecting on your own experience and about some of the matters that were spoken about, or maybe reflections on the actions that were recommended for cities to take or for national governments to take. So the question here is that a lot has been said about capacity building, development and support. How can we lobby funders, so governments, DFIs, accredited entities, etc., to change their funding requirements to reflect issues faced by municipalities in accessing these climate resources, namely to prevent funders from reproducing existing resource and societal inequities? This is a very big question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it justice alone. So if anybody would also like to respond in the Q&A, please do. From my perspective, I would say that there is a lot of work underway by many of the kind of city membership organizations. So ICLEI C40, there's also kind of there's the Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, which is a kind of collection of a number of organizations working on this very topic. So you can have a look at their website also, the CCFLA, which have many great resources, and we'll discuss some of them on Friday. Because on Friday, we're really getting into the detail about actual applications. So this session itself is more about an overview of finance, climate finance. But to change funding requirements is I would say, a socio-political process that takes place. And we have seen positive trajectories, as I would say, in terms of this, or positive trends around cities, around how funders are, the requirements that funders are putting out there. So, you know, ensuring that your funding, for some funding applications now having to ensure that you have national buy-in or beneficiary buy-in, actually even at the proposal development stage, I think is important to ensure that, you know, work is done in alignment with national priorities, for example, such as the nationally developed contributions of each country, that sort of thing, so that what we're doing is trying to crowd finance into the plans and kind of programs that have been developed by national government rather than duplicating efforts. So I think it's that. I myself have never stood in the shoes of a funder, for example. So I also speak from one perspective. So yeah, if there are any other perspectives, please share. But I think when we talk about funders, that is such a broad group. So it's one word that we use for a very large group, as you've mentioned here, government, DFIs, accredited entities. And I would say, you know, what you're speaking to here is about change management, or just a kind of transformative change. And one of the ways to do that I've found effective is relationship. So getting to know who the people are in these organizations, in these institutions, and actually saying, this is what we need. Like, and so forming those relationships is, I think, one of the key ways that I've found to be helpful in kind of trying to address how funding flows to some extent, and kind of looking to develop partnerships. Would also be quite key there. Funds are, so as you saw in the video about the climate finance, there's another video which is in the resource that we'll share at the end of the end of this presentation on the final slide, around the Green Climate Fund and how the Green Climate Fund sets up and evaluates proposals. So what they've tried to do there is actually not only have kind of national government representatives, but also representatives of community groups and that sort of thing, which can come into the decision-making process. So there are efforts to try and limit any kind of inequalities or exacerbating any inequalities, and rather addressing them. So that would be my perspective on that question there. But again, Nkaniso has asked a question. So if I heard correctly, Sir Olympus Mantata said they carry out training programs that can help cities to prepare proposals up to bankability stage. Can these programs be accessed by cities outside of South Africa? So the DBSA actually does have a kind of continent, or at least at very minimum Sub-Saharan Africa-wide focus. So yes, so the DBSA has the project preparation facility. So it's kind of, if you think of DBSA as a house, it's their front door, and they have an application that needs to be filled in. That application does require some data and some kind of feasibility work to have been completed. But if you have a feasibility study, going to a project preparation facility, which there are a number active in Africa, both external organizations external to Africa, but also ones based here in Africa, in different parts of the continent. You can then translate your feasibility study into that application, and that's how you would start that process on actually, starting that process around developing a project proposal further. So DBSA is, of course, not the only development bank. We have the African Development Bank. If you're in Rwanda, you also have FUNEWA. FUNEWA has a great kind of resource available, or training resource available online to support cities to access funding through FUNEWA. But again, they're only active in Rwanda. So Nkaniso, I'm not sure where you're based. If you want to put that in the chat, and then so the other thing to do is to see, do you have any accredited entities in your municipality, in your country, or who is the national designated authority in your country, and also speak to them about what are the opportunities to build capacity. But yes, DBSA is available to not just South Africa. So they're actually available to many countries across Africa. Okay, then we have a question from Namonde. How best can we access funding, and how do we target funders who have an appetite for the nature of local government projects? So this is very important because you're right, there is a certain nature of local government projects. Often they tend to be a bit smaller in size, and so you need funders who are not looking to put in, 100 million euros into a project. That's not a feasible size for almost all municipalities. That's a lot of money. So I would recommend looking at some of the development banks. So the African Development Bank has the Municipal Urban Infrastructure Fund, which has recently been established. There's the also partnering with kind of the local government, your local government association, going to them, seeing what opportunities there are, but also write us an email at ICLEI Africa, or reach out to also, I know UCLGA is also active in this space around supporting cities. And then we can have a kind of more detailed discussion, because what often happens is when I start a process of kind of developing a project and looking for funders, you have to do a bit of research and say, okay, who's funded projects like this before? Because that's often an indicator of appetite to fund these sorts of projects. So I don't want to necessarily say funders' names because maybe their funding requirements for this year have changed or that sort of thing. But often the people who are funding projects, often through DFIs, are like KfW, AFD. So these are all acronyms. It's a bit of an acronym soup. KfW is the German Development Bank. AFD is the French Development Agency. We also have kind of own national grant systems coming in. So that's why you often need to find who your intermediary is as a local government, or engage with kind of the country office of the funder. That would be a first step, I would say. There's a great comment here from Yangbo. It says, I just want to share it with everyone. So it helps to reframe climate finance or other forms of green finance as something core to service delivery, as opposed to an add-on, for example, some form of charity. Once individual savers and pensioners realize where their money is going, a broad consensus for equitable climate finance can emerge. So here they're speaking about two matters. So first of all, the idea that climate finance, so as I mentioned, the definition of climate finance is any money that goes towards achieving climate goals. All of our infrastructure investment should be aligned with climate goals. So either reducing greenhouse gases or reducing vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Therefore, all finance in an ideal world would actually be climate finance. And that's really important. So it's core to service delivery, because without addressing climate change in your service delivery implementation plans, you are actually potentially undermining the good that service delivery infrastructure or kind of service is providing, because over time, if we don't address climate change, we can already start to feel the impacts now. If we don't address climate change, first of all, we'll miss out on some of the opportunities that currently still exist in terms of, new markets and building, new job creation opportunities, but also we'll have to deal with even worse impacts of climate change. So you're very right, Youngbo, in terms of service, it needs to be kind of really core. And climate finance must be framed as something core to service delivery. Also, you're speaking here about the kind of institutional investors. So when we speak about institutional investors, we're speaking about pension funds. So this is also another area, growing area of interest in terms of how do we make sure that the people who, manage those funds, they think very long term, because you put in a pension, say when, you start putting in a pension in your 20s or 30s, and you only get paid out in your 60s or so. And so they have to look after that money for a really long period of time. So they're thinking very long term, but fundamentally their finances or their returns on their investment are going to be impacted by climate change, because climate change is also having very long-term impacts and kind of reshaping how the world kind of operates and what's the uncertainty around that. So what's important there is to ensure that these institutional investors are also investing in climate change. So this is a new source of potential funds for what should be core to all service delivery and infrastructure provision, which is addressing climate change. So there's a question about how to kind of engage with the DBSA. I would start with their website, but also please email us at ICLEI, and we can see who would be the most appropriate people to contact there, because we know we can ask a few questions. But yes, so their website and their kind of contact page, if nothing else, is a first start. Okay, Nkaniso is from Zimbabwe. So yes, so definitely, I think also to speak to the DBSA, also reach out on their website there. Okay, great. So that's we can also take some questions a bit later, but I think what we're going to do now is we're going to move to kind of unpacking what is a good climate project, because this is very important to have in our minds when we first start thinking about climate projects, because not all projects are climate projects. All projects can be motivated to be a climate project, I believe. I believe that is possible, but not all. You do have to be able to make the case, and especially if you want to access dedicated climate finance, then you need to have a very strong climate motivation and climate impact, and demonstrate a positive climate impact. So that's very important. So let's unpack, what do we mean by a good climate project? So first of all, I would say we need to think of projects a bit more broadly than maybe we would initially think of them. So I would say that projects can actually be undertaken in 3 areas for climate action. So first of all is institutional. So how can local governments be organized to enable more decision-making around and build more resilient institutions? So this, I think, is a valuable kind of way in creating that enabling environment. So what institutional changes are needed? And how does the government actually engage with other key stakeholders? So how does your municipality or your local government actually partner or enable partnering with the private sector or community groups, or even small business, SMEs, small businesses, that sort of thing? And also, how does your municipality actually make decisions around climate change? So climate change is not always a directly mandated responsibility of local governments. So this is happening increasingly so. But what's often important is that climate change isn't one sector's responsibility, but is rather an interdepartmental responsibility. And so, you need to have people engaging on water, urban planning, electricity, all these sorts of matters in order to address climate change in municipalities. So how are you enabling that group to make decisions together? So this looks different in different municipalities. Some municipalities put climate change in the mayor's office. Some municipalities have a unit, but they have the ability to kind of draw in different people like champions from each different department, that sort of thing. Another version of a climate project could be an infrastructure project. So here, this is implementation of physical projects. So in very colloquially, I like to say something you can kick. So it's a water reticulation. It could be something like a water reticulation systems or restoration of wetlands. So it could be kind of what's called grey infrastructure, traditionally understood as infrastructure, but also then, of course, green infrastructure. How do we use our nature-based solutions, that sort of thing. But it's something physical. And so this is an infrastructure project. So what's important, I think, is that often we think of climate projects as infrastructure projects only. So what I'm just doing is providing a little bit of a broader understanding of what we could think of as a project. And then, of course, behavioral. So how is your local government supporting changes and actions by citizens, such as awareness campaigns, community mobilization, and response, and then resource demand management? So, you know, if you know from your climate planning as part of your enabling environment, that your municipality the climate is actually going to get drier over time. So your water resources are going to be more constrained over time. How do you embed kind of water demand management? So encouraging people to use less water and to turn off the taps and not irrigate in the middle of the day, that sort of thing. How are you encouraging those behavioral changes to make your municipality or subnational government more climate resilient? So I'll mainly be speaking to infrastructure projects now, but I just wanted to start with this overview of that actually you can look at a number of different types of projects. So what's also important is that with an infrastructure project, we need to think of the construction phase and the operational phase. So very often we think about the construction phase and the project is designed there, but a good climate project is one that considers how is this project operated, how is it funded during its operation, not only how is it financed for its capital expenditure or CapEx. Also, what's also important to note is that there are various forms of contracting that of course take place. And this is a critical part in terms of de-risking the project. And so good capacity for contract management, whether it's in-house in the local government, subnational government, or whether it's in, you know, externally sourced to provide that assistance, becomes incredibly important, especially when you're engaging kind of some more of the private sector financial mechanisms that are available. And of course, understanding your cash flows, both in construction phase and operational phase. So this is just a quick reminder that we need to think across both these phases at the very minimum. There are, of course, other phases, pre-construction phase. There's a lot of work that goes into a project also. So this is another important aspect, which is that a good climate project is a solution to a climate problem. Now, this sounds very obvious. It almost sounds too obvious to state. But for example, this picture shows a picture of urban flooding, which is a very regular occurrence in many cities across Africa, across the world. So there are actually, if we think about how we say, okay, it's going to, you know, urban flooding, okay, we immediately jump to this is a climate problem. We can apply for climate finance to fix it or to address it or to install some infrastructure, implement infrastructure to address it. But actually, we need to interrogate, is this a climate problem? Is this being caused by a climate impact? Because actually, is this a regular amount of water that is expected for this area, but financial management, urban management has not been fully addressed, and there's actually litter that is clogging the drains. So this is an urban management issue. It's not a climate issue, because it's not, this flooding is a result of blocked drains caused from litter and waste management, not from actual an increase in the amount of rainfall in an area. Another kind of, another way to, so if we were to say, okay, we know that it's going to, we have the data from our risk and vulnerability assessment, which I'd really encourage you also to have a, to join tomorrow's session, because this will also unpack some of that. So how do we plan with finance in mind as a session? I'd also recommend you attend tomorrow morning from 10 to 12:30, because it will go into some of the climate action planning processes. But we could say this picture could also represent an actual climate hazard that needs to be addressed. So over time, it is now getting, the amount of water we receive is being received in a shorter period of time. And so the flooding, and that's due to climate change, that's due to a change in climatic conditions. And therefore, addressing this flooding is actually a climate problem. So this is really important because this is where data is very helpful in understanding the nature of a problem and really interrogating the nature of a problem and how that problem is actually caused by climate change is very important. So another way in which this picture could have happened, or this flooding could have happened, is that, maybe it was the normal amount of rainfall that was expected to be received, but the city has expanded really fast. And actually, what has happened is that urban development has taken place in a flood zone, potentially. So that flood zone it's actually an urban development management issue. It's not due to the climate changing. So these are the things that, especially on climate finance side and fund managers, they really want you to motivate very strongly that it is a climate challenge and that your project will solve it. Okay. So that's the first thing. And this is just also from my own experience in working with cities to identify and develop projects to access climate finance, is that this is sometimes a tricky matter because there are a number of competing and really important aspects that need to be addressed in a municipality, but we really have to interrogate, can we access climate finance? Because it's quite a long journey, as Karina reflected on, it can be quite resource intensive. So we don't want to go all the way down that road and we aren't even addressing a climate problem. Okay, so the direct impacts, I've not mentioned this a few times, but often we have to, for climate finance proposals, actually quantify the number of people, sorry, there's an error in my slide there, number of people who are now made less vulnerable or their vulnerability is reduced to a climate hazard. So the climate hazards, they are through a risk and vulnerability assessment, and they are identified. So if it's increased variability of rainfall, whether it's getting drier or wetter, or if the rainy or dry seasons are shifting, that sort of thing. So yeah, climate related hazards. Again, not all hazards are climate related. So that's also very important. So there are a number of disaster risk matters that need to be addressed, but we need to make sure it's a climate-related hazard. Okay, so for example, addressing an earthquake is not necessarily a direct climate hazard, but it's a very important issue, of course. But applying for climate finance to address that matter is not going to be as strong an argument. It can be a co-benefit, but it wouldn't be as strong an argument as addressing kind of reduced, increased heat, urban heat, or due to increasing temperatures, or adapting to drier conditions due to reduction in rainfall over on an annual basis. Mitigation, the goal here is a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and often requires a quantification of that reduction. So here, this is where having a partner that can provide that external kind of technical support is very helpful. And of course, you must also look at the indirect impacts of a climate project, both upstream and downstream benefits. Okay, so your project isn't actually only doing one thing. You can really think quite widely about all the different benefits, and that comes back to that impact potential that we spoke about earlier, making the case that your project is going to have quite a significant impact for the money that you will receive. And then, of course, we have to touch on, they're called co-benefits, but they shouldn't be like a side part of the meal. They're essential they're core to the project. And really looking at, these are a number of things that are actually almost scored when looking at calls for proposals and kind of funding requirements, is increasing gender equality. So how are women and other marginalized groups benefiting directly from this project? You could join the gender training session that we're having on the 10th of, I think it's the 10th, sorry, of November, as part of the LOCS Congress, to unpack how do we actually embed gender? What are the different aspects that we need to consider? Because it's not only about employing employing women in a project, so that's one way, but also how do we increase women's ability to have decision-making power in projects and systems? That's another example. And of course, job creation, poverty reduction, support to other marginalized groups. So this will depend on your context according to who is considered marginalized, mainly economically and or socially marginalized. So people with disabilities, people of certain kind of ethnic or racial groups, you know, we can go on, but it will be specific to your context. And then of course, increased biodiversity. So biodiversity is a very important aspect of kind of global change at the moment that you would have heard a lot about. And so climate projects can have very positive benefits for biodiversity also, which is very important, of course. So where do we find these projects? I think that's an important point we need to understand. So the first is, as part of the enabling environment, you know, we shouldn't just be plucking projects out of, you know, we believe it as a, maybe you're one individual official sitting there and you think it's a good project. You really want to be looking at your kind of strategic planning documents and to see what are the projects that are currently planned for, or are, you know, even if it's 3 to 5 years down the line, or even longer term. So if you have something like a 10 to, you know, 20-year plan in your municipality, can also look more, you know, in that longer term. And for different projects and the kind of what we often call catalytic projects on the continent. So these, so I would suggest starting looking at those sorts of plans, those development plans that, and budgets, 3-year kind of budgets as a starting point, to say what are the projects that are currently planned in your local government or subnational government, and they actually are motivated as climate change projects. So this is very kind of obvious that, okay, this is a climate project. Not all municipalities have this. If you've gone through a climate action planning process, then you are more likely to have this list of projects. Another kind of way in which projects can be identified is they can be planned, but they haven't got a specific, they actually don't have a specific climate action yet, but they are relevant. So for example, if you're upgrading your wastewater treatment works to improve water kind of and energy efficiency, that's a climate project. It just hasn't been identified as such, okay? So that could be partly some of the role that maybe some of you want to take on, is to actually look through the list of projects that your municipality is looking to work on. Then also we have kind of planned but required work to have so it's a planned project, but it actually requires work to have a direct climate change impact. So for example, you know, maybe your local government is planning a new landfill, which is a regular project of many municipalities across, or local governments across the continent, or even subnational governments, provincial, state level. So, you know, waste is a relatively significant source of greenhouse gases on the continent. And there are a lot of benefits in terms of how we manage our waste, in terms of maybe being an energy source that could then have positive benefits for reducing the use of biomass, and then, you know, having improved biodiversity to allow forests to flourish. So you have for example, you have a landfill project, and what you can do is actually just re-look at that project and redesign it a little bit to say, okay, so we have this landfill project, our waste composition is maybe 60% organic, as it is in many African cities, it's quite high organic load. How do we actually either create compost that can be used in agricultural activities, or how do we capture the methane? And by doing those two things alone, you are reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that planned landfill project. There are also a number of other initiatives you can, of course, take. But that is how you would take a planned project that doesn't have a climate change impact, but could have a climate change impact. And then, of course, you have projects that are not yet identified or planned. And this is where it's really important to kind of, you know, maybe you're facing a challenge that has not yet been addressed in any of your plans, and actually requires a whole new approach. So the example I like to use here is, for example, using, you know, you have a flooding challenge, or you need to manage stormwater, and instead of using kind of concrete pipes to get water away as fast as possible, you actually rethink the whole stormwater management system and implement sustainable urban drainage systems, which looks to kind of slow down the flow of water, allow for infiltration, so it allows for a number of co-benefits associated with it. So this is kind of where you would maybe start looking for what is a climate project that you could start to develop as a municipality. So another aspect is a good climate project is a well-prepared climate project. So we're going to touch on this in more detail on Friday. But what's really important here is that you can see this is actually part of kind of the GCOM identified process, so the Global Covenant of Mayors. And you can have a look at their work, also some very helpful resources there. And if you look at the early stage preparation, you're really looking at, you're starting at the enabling environment, and that is kind of the policies and process. Is sustainability and climate change actually embedded as a goal? Is being a climate resilient municipality embedded as a goal in terms of the 5-year plan or the 20-year plan? Then has any climate action planning been done? And from that climate action planning to actually do project identification and prioritization, and then to move into project kind of pre-feasibility, because what you're doing is you're preparing this project, you're actually ensuring the robustness of the project every step you take along this kind of process. It's not always a linear process, even though here it's represented as one. But what's important is that we understand these different steps so that we can resource them properly, and that we can actually understand that it does take a little bit of time to work through from kind of project idea through to implementation. And these are the different steps. Project pre-feasibility is, I would say that a municipality, relatively well capacitated, doesn't have to be the highest capacity municipality, could do up to the project identification and prioritization themselves. I think where external consultants start to become valuable is in the project pre-feasibility, project feasibility onwards stage, because it does require very specific skills that subnational governments don't always have in-house, because they're not always, needed right now. But then once we've done project feasibility, to go into project structuring. So project feasibility really looks at, is something technically possible? Is the kind of the technical solution, is it available? Will it work? That sort of thing. And then the financial feasibility said, financially, will this make sense? Is there the cash flow to support the financial mechanism? All those things that we kind of spoke about a bit earlier, that's what the pre-feasibility and project and feasibility does. But what's really important is that there are, as Olympus actually mentioned, there are so many project feasibility that get done, but they don't get taken forward. So it's really important that there's a champion in the municipality, subnational government, that is able to hold that project feasibility and actually then take it forward. And also that through that pre-feasibility and feasibility process, you're actually identifying potential funders for your project in those stages there. And then looking at project structuring, so how is it actually going to work, looking at contracting and more of that. Then transaction, the actual flow of funds, and then actually how do you then review the project post its implementation. So of course, there's a lot that happens between transaction and implementation. But this is a kind of high level overview of what it means to have a well-prepared project. So again, this good climate project is one that considers the whole of the project. So really important here is that you don't only think about the construction phase or the operation phase, but also what happens at the end of life of the project. And this also feeds into the financial and technical feasibility of projects. And very often we think of kind of project execution, but aren't thinking fully of kind of operation and end of life. And without thinking of operation, we end up with what is colloquially termed white elephants. So projects that just sit there and actually don't realize the benefit that they were designed for. Then, of course, a good climate project is also one that manages and identifies and manages all project-related risk. So here, this is part of what you do in even the prioritization phase of that kind of preparation pipeline, is you start looking at which are the projects which are kind of lower risk projects. And risk occurs within a project. It occurs within an organization, but it can also be external. So, if the kind of, the ratings agency changes, downgrades your country, that's external to the project. okay? You have to find a way to manage it, but it's external to the project. You do not have control as a project manager over that aspect. Organization, if whoever's owning the project, so is the municipality owning the project, then is the good governance and robust financial management in place to manage the project and manage the risks associated with this project within the organization. So, you know, is there going to be a capacity risk, or you know, for example, staff not being available to actually work on the project or support the project or manage it. And this is why often you find partnerships with the private sector or community groups can help de-risk projects because they provide that additional capacity. And then within the project itself. So, you know, you really want to consider risks. There will be kind of socioeconomic risks, maybe, you know, you have to, in certain countries, you have to consider strike action and that sort of thing, and how do we manage that? But then also there are other, you know, and there's whole ideas of risk management, and we'll talk a bit more about it on Friday, as I know we are running out of time quite quickly here. But this is very important because often risk identification and management is not very well considered, especially in the early stages of a project, and it actually undermines the quality of proposals that funders look at. So it's important to include partners. I've mentioned this numerous times, and you can have a look at this slide, but really the benefit is around who can provide additional capacity and resources, who can provide political support, and who can actually provide maybe possible additional funding, especially for that project preparation phase. And then this is just a summary of what a good climate project, really having a well-written proposal. So we're going to go into more detail on Friday on this, but really having a deep understanding of the problem, a presentation and governance of the project. So who has a role and what is that role? Policy alignment here. So how does this project achieve the nationally determined contributions and the SDGs? So SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals at the global level, nationally determined contributions at the national level in your country. Every country has it. Read your NDCs and other climate policies, because you have to, a good climate project always aligns with those and ensures their implementation. Also, it has cross-cutting impact, and the scope of the project is one that also kind of supports co-benefits. It also demonstrates a participatory approach, so there's been stakeholder consultation. It's not just one person. You need to demonstrate that this idea isn't just your own idea, but rather that there is ownership of it more broadly within the organization, within the community. As I've mentioned, risk mitigation strategy, project structuring, sustainability of the project, really important. What happens long term? What happens once the funding has finished? How will you continue to fund the project or finance the project? How will the project be managed once this initial phase has maybe been completed? And then, of course, we've discussed gender and vulnerable groups component. So just to close, to kind of finish up here on the slides, is really, this is some of kind of my key go-to resources that I just thought I'd share with you. These are, of course, just scratching the surface in terms of some of the resources available. Also, the video I shared with Olympus is one of a series of videos that's available on the ICLEI Africa YouTube channel that you can go have a look at to learn more about answering those same questions, but from different kind of climate finance experts' experiences and perspectives, especially in terms of, you know, Olympus gave us more of a continent perspective, and then we have some examples of kind of global perspectives. I see we have a few questions and comments here. There's also some great resources being shared in the Q&A, so please have a look at that also and jot those down. And then I see that there is a question in French. I imagine it is to do around translation of the session in French. So for this, I do want to apologize that the session wasn't available in French today, but we will look at another opportunity to provide the session in French, actually even, you know, not having translation, but actually having it being presented in French. So in the climate finance series, that I made on the ICLEI Africa YouTube channel, there are actually two videos in French. So one from AFD and one from FMDV that I'd also recommend that you take a look at. But we will be looking to present this Climate Finance 101 in French and maybe even in Portuguese at some point. My French colleagues will assist with that. So I think with that, we will then, oh, I see that there is a question. We're just going to translate this question and then we'll speak to it quickly, if that's okay. So if you just give us just a moment to translate it. Apologies, I don't actually speak French. I do wish to, but yes. But while we are just waiting for the translation so I can respond to this question, I really wanted to thank you all for your time. And because this video will be available, this recording will be available, please feel free to share it with colleagues and other people you believe would be benefit from this. Please feel free to reach out to us. Also in the social lounge, you can drop us a message in the social lounge and we can respond via email or in the social lounge of the platform that you're currently on. And please continue to join us for the rest of LOCS. In particular, those 3 other training sessions I noted, but I would say the Cabinet of Mayors Sub-Saharan Africa Day at LOCS tomorrow would be very beneficial in terms of unpacking how do we plan with finance in mind, so how do we plan in a way that our projects will ultimately be able to access finance, and hearing from financiers and funders themselves. And then also looking at the COMSA roadmap. So again, a very tangible, practical tool that can be used by cities to move your project along that project preparation pipeline. So this is only the beginning, I'd like to say, and thank you so much for joining us. In terms of the question that we received from Ariel, I would just like to, I'm just going to read it out quickly as our final question. So I'd just like to know how to access the Green Climate Fund and how a national funding agency can join these funds to finance EU climate-related projects in their country. So I think to finance. Okay, so in terms of this question, I think the first thing I would say is to go to the Green Climate Fund website and to look for your national, the national designated authority, the NDA, who would be the national government focal point responsible for liaising and kind of with the GCF, but also kind of approving projects or signing off on approval of projects, and then also to look for any accredited entities. So if you, I'm not sure where you are based, Ariel, but if you are based in Africa, there's the African Development Bank. There's of course, there's also a resource. So we can also make a resource available, which compiles, that we have available, that compiles all the NDAs and the accredited entities for all the different countries in Africa. So that would be the starting point. I'm not sure, Ariel, if you're working at a city. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're working at a city, but that would be the first kind of starting point. And then the final question is around projects that are financed through carbon credits. So again, carbon credits are another mechanism that are available to certain projects. You have to be able to continually prove the carbon kind of mitigation or carbon sequestration potential of your project, and actually its real value. So the monitoring and evaluation of your project is very important to continue the benefit there. There are a number of successful carbon carbon credit projects that are on the continent that I know of. One of them is the eThekwini landfill site, which was partially financed through the carbon credits, and that's an energy project. So it has a very obvious, very strong, very direct link to reducing carbon. And there are a number of other projects that I know Nedbank is working on around forestry and cook stoves and that sort of thing related to also the carbon credits. So I personally don't use the carbon credits mechanism, but that's because I'm actually more sit in that intermediary space and other financiers do. So again, I hope that this has been the start of a journey, and I wasn't able to necessarily answer all the questions, I think, to the full extent, but I really hope that this has kind of opened your mind to, you know, especially that triangle that we started off with the enabling environment, working on that, and then actually looking to your internal resources, what is available, and how can that be used to its best of its ability to actually, you know, make climate change at the core of service delivery as was mentioned earlier by one of our participants, and then to look externally. And often it's about partnering in order to look externally. So partnering with other support organizations, your local government associations, city membership organizations such as ICLEI Africa. And I'd really encourage you also to make use of the TAP, the Transformative Action Program, as a starting point in terms of how to turn an idea into a kind of project, the start of a project proposal. So I'd also really recommend that you take a look at the TAP application website, which has an annual kind of call for projects, and then we try to match requirements with requests for funding with funders. It doesn't fund projects itself, but we try to do a bit of a bringing together of subnational governments with potential funders and financiers. So on that note, I will say thank you very much for attending, and also I really hope to see you in some of the other sessions, especially the TAP training session, which will go even into more detail around actual proposal